standing in the middle of my devastated field, seething with disbelief. Fresh tire tracks from a Jeep slice through my crops, turning ripe vegetables into shredded debris. This isn't just vandalism, it's war. If you've battled an overbearing homeowners association before, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because I'm done bowing to their threats. This farmland is my legacy, and I refuse to let them stomp all over it. Stay tuned. Things are about to explode soon. I cut the camera, my anger pulsing through every muscle. My name is Grant Sorensen, and I've spent my life nurturing these acres. They were my grandfather's before they were my father's, and now they're mine. Each season I rotate crops, fertilize carefully, and harvest by hand. Around me, the farmland is battered, with fence posts splintered and several neat rows of vegetables torn apart by that Jeep's rampage. This entire fiasco began quietly. Some years back, a corporate developer bought land next to my family's property, building a polished neighborhood they dubbed Ridgeway Pines. At first, I didn't mind. The homeowners seemed pleasant enough. Some even visited my roadside stand on weekends, buying fresh produce and complimenting my dedication. But as the neighborhood grew, so did its homeowners association, and the influence of one determined individual named Mrs. Gray. Mrs. Gray runs the HOA like a corporate board, fixated on property values and aesthetics. She isn't the type to wave hello over a picket fence. Instead, she sends letters on crisp stationery, each typed paragraph a pointed reprimand. Initially, her issues were trivial. The color of my barn, the height of my windbreak trees, the unfortunate smell of livestock if I dared keep goats. I tried making small accommodations, painting the barn's exterior a bright clean red, trimming branches, even reducing my livestock. But nothing satisfied her. Then came rumors of expansion, whispers that the HOA wanted to approve a multi-use development, possibly a boutique hotel that would edge right up to my land. One neighbor confided that she'd heard Mrs. Gray brag about turning my farmland into part of some communal amenity. I brushed it aside as idle chatter, believing nobody had the authority to force me out. This farm predates their entire development. But a few days before the Jeep incident, Mrs. Gray sent me a letter. Carefully worded, it stated that underutilized tracts near Ridgeway Pines might be rezoned for more suitable uses. The subtext was clear: sell or face the consequences. I felt my jaw tighten just reading it. I'm no stranger to adversity, but the implied threat lit a spark of defiance. The night my fields got torn up, I was indoors, finalizing orders for a local farmer's market. I heard an engine roaring near the fence line, but by the time I rushed outside, all I saw were fresh tire marks stretching across the farmland. It took everything in me not to hurl my toolbox at the taillights, vanishing down the road. My fence was crushed, rows of crops annihilated. The Jeep's path cut straight through the heart of my best produce: tomatoes, squash, cucumbers. If it was an accident, it made no sense. The property line is well marked. I reported the vandalism to the police. An officer arrived, shook his head, took pictures, and promised a follow-up. But I could tell he didn't expect much to come from it. Lacking cameras that captured the exact moment, I couldn't pin it on Mrs. Gray or her associates. Furious, I filmed the aftermath for documentation. That footage is what you saw in my introduction clip. Word travels fast in a small community. My best friend Marcus came by the next day. We grew up together, fishing in the creek that borders my land and skipping rocks when chores were done. Now Marcus works as a civil engineer, specializing in property development. He's also tangled with Ridgeway Pines HOA before, albeit on a smaller scale. They once fined him for painting his shutters an unapproved shade of blue. Ever since, he's had zero trust in their heavy-handed tactics. Standing beside me at the ruined fence, Marcus snapped a few pictures on his phone, muttering curses under his breath. "They want to scare you into selling," he said. "You know that, right?" "Yeah, but I'm not selling." "Good," Marcus replied, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Look, let's gather everything we have: documents, survey maps, any letters they've sent. I'll help you piece together a case. There might be local statutes protecting farmland from forced rezoning. I felt a tightness in my chest, not just from anger, but also from a creeping sense of dread. Was I about to spiral into a legal war with people who had deeper pockets than me? I glanced around, recalling every memory etched into this land. The tree where my father carved our initials, the old barn my grandfather built. My family's sweat and dreams are in this soil. Surrender wasn't an option. Still, worry lingered. I live next door to my mother, who's not in the best health. She's pleaded with me for years to avoid confrontation. Seeing her anxious face when she visited after the vandalism, I nearly wavered. She placed a trembling hand on my shoulder, saying, "Grant, they have money and influence. Don't poke a bear you can't beat." I clenched my jaw, remembering the night she comforted me as a child whenever storms battered our fields. "I won't let them take what Grandpa built," I whispered. She sighed, eyes reflecting concern. "Just be cautious." I tried to reassure her. "I will, but I'm not letting them bully me." Marcus and I spent hours examining boundary surveys. One map was older than me, drawn up by a local surveyor decades back, showing my farmland's original dimensions. Ridgeway pines didn't exist then. There was also a more recent survey from when the developer purchased land near mine, but the line seemed suspiciously fuzzy. Some portions made it look like the neighborhood extended further onto territory that used to be farmland. We made copies, highlighting the discrepancies. Meanwhile, I posted a short clip on social media showing the tire damage and the ruined rows of produce. I didn't name names, but I called out certain individuals who believed farmland was theirs to destroy. Unexpectedly, my post caught fire. Locals expressed outrage, and even folks from out of state commented about HOAs gone rogue. People asked if I needed donations. Though I was touched by the support, I declined. I just wanted the truth out. But the real blow arrived 2 days later in the form of another letter from Mrs. Gray, typed in that same formal style. She regretted any unfortunate damage, claiming the Jeep belonged to a visitor, not an HOA member, but ended with a note that read, "We remain committed to ensuring Ridgeway Pines evolves. Should you reconsider our long-standing offer, do let us know promptly." I nearly ripped the paper in half. Her tone made it sound like my farmland was just an eyesore in need of repurposing. I called her. She didn't pick up, so I left a message. "Whatever you're planning, stop. I'm not selling, and I'm not backing down." My voice trembled a bit, but frustration fueled me forward. I half expected a return call dripping with condescension, but none came. Instead, the next day I saw her black SUV idling near my damaged fence line. She never got out, just observed me for a while, then drove off. Marcus arrived to help me repair the fence, tension bristling in the air. We hammered fresh boards into place. Each strike of the hammer was a vow. I wouldn't let them do this again. After we finished, Marcus took me aside. "Grant, maybe you should get cameras," he said. "I know it's expensive, but you need security." I nodded, exhaling. "I'll figure it out. The next time they pull a stunt like this, I want proof." That afternoon, we discovered a rumored development plan online, a boutique hotel annexing part of the neighborhood. Further reading suggested they wanted to incorporate scenic farmland views as a selling point. My blood boiled. Scenic farmland? They wanted to spin my fields into a marketing gimmick while bullying me off it? We decided enough was enough. Marcus used his engineering contacts to gather inside info on the developer's timeline. Rumor had it they planned to break ground soon, pending final approvals and, presumably, my compliance. They must have assumed I'd cave under pressure. So I did what any desperate landowner might do. I lawyered up, scraping together funds. The attorney, recommended by a friend, gave me a cautious but supportive response. "It'll be an uphill battle. HOAs are powerful, but if your land predates their domain, you have rights they can't ignore. And if we can prove they deliberately damaged your property, that strengthens your position." I spent days collecting every scrap of evidence. The older surveys were crucial as they proved my boundaries. I also compiled the harassing letters, the photos and videos of the vandalism, and statements from neighbors who'd witnessed odd activity late at night. A few were too scared to go on record, but some were fed up with the HOA's overreach and willing to speak up. During one tense afternoon, as I was salvaging what remained of my damaged crops, two men in suits came by, introducing themselves as representatives from the development company. They tried to be cordial, praising my farmland's rustic charm, but their real mission became apparent when they offered me a settlement, a sum that might have enticed me if I were a casual landowner looking for a quick payday. They cited market value numbers, ignoring that this land was priceless to me. I turned them down flat. One man shrugged, the other glanced around as if sizing up the territory. "We'll be in touch," he said, walking away. That night, Marcus and I pored over county records, verifying that farmland here is shielded by certain agricultural protections. Our best hope was that if the HOA wanted to convert it, they'd need my explicit cooperation or a rezoning push, which we could fight with enough community backing. The problem was, they might keep attacking in underhanded ways, cutting deals with local officials, forging alliances with deeper pockets. My mother fretted, but I assured her we had a plan: gather evidence, rally neighbors, prepare for legal action. In truth, I was petrified. I couldn't match their budgets, especially for a prolonged legal war. The possibility of losing the farm loomed like a thundercloud. Then came a vital breakthrough. Marcus discovered a land survey indicating the developer's planned hotel overlapped more than a dozen feet into my property. If correct, they were literally building part of their foundation on farmland they didn't own. The survey was from a reputable firm, sealed and approved, though overshadowed by the developer's more recent paperwork. Perhaps they banked on me not having the resources to challenge them. "This is a game changer," Marcus said, excitement shining in his eyes. "If they're encroaching, you can force them to halt construction. Heck, you might even have the right to remove any structures built on your land." I stared at the lines on the map. My farmland boundary, bold and unmistakable, extended into what the developer had labeled future hotel suites. A wave of relief washed over me. I might actually have leverage. If I threatened a lawsuit for encroachment, they'd have to negotiate from a weaker position. Mrs. Gray and her cronies wouldn't enjoy that. As I processed this revelation, the swirl of emotions reminded me how high the stakes were. They'd already shown they weren't above sabotage. If I used this information, they might escalate. But backing down was no longer an option. The next couple of weeks passed in a tense dance. I filed complaints with the county, citing the newly discovered overlap. Officials promised to look into it, though they seemed overwhelmed by political pressure. Meanwhile, construction continued at a steady pace near the far edge of the neighborhood. I watched from a distance as machinery shaped the ground, presumably for the hotel's foundation. My land, or at least part of it, was in their path. One gray afternoon, I confronted Mrs. Gray at the HOA office. She was flanked by two associates, both giving me cold stares. I presented copies of the survey, stating that any building crossing onto my property had to be removed. Mrs. Gray's face remained impassive, though a muscle twitched in her jaw. She gave a dainty laugh, calling the documents out. When I refused to leave, she threatened to call security. "Your land is a nuisance," she snapped. "A patch of dirt stands between us and the future of Ridgeway Pines." I glared. "My farmland isn't a patch of dirt. It's been in my family for generations, and it's not yours." She smiled thinly. "We'll see what the courts say." So that was her angle. Drag me into a costly, lengthy legal battle. In her mind, I'd crumble under mounting fees. I left the office trembling, both from anger and raw fear. But I vowed not to let intimidation tactics rob me of my birthright. Marcus and I huddled that night, discussing next moves. Our attorney believed we could file for an injunction to halt construction if we proved they'd begun building on my property. The process, however, was cumbersome, requiring precise evidence that might not be fully confirmed until they poured concrete. We had to time our challenge carefully. In the interim, more of my equipment started turning up damaged, and once, someone tampered with my greenhouse temperature controls, risking an entire batch of seedlings. It felt like psychological warfare. I installed a couple of motion sensor cameras, though they captured only vague silhouettes moving in the night. The police again seemed sympathetic but powerless, without clear facial ID. Then came the day that changed everything. I spotted rebar and framing for the hotel protruding dangerously close to my boundary stakes. It looked like part of the foundation actually extended a few feet into my land. The final straw right before my eyes. I phoned my attorney, who prepared documents for an immediate injunction. But part of me burned with a desire for direct action. Should I have waited for the courts? Perhaps. But when you watch your life's work and heritage get invaded, a switch flips. Anger combined with desperation can drive people to bold extremes. That's where my mind was heading, swirling with unyielding resolve. If they bulldoze my farmland, I'll bulldoze their project. Marcus arrived, noticing my restless expression. I explained the rebar situation, fighting the urge to storm over there with my tractor. I could physically remove anything on my land, I seethed. I have the legal right, don't I? He hesitated. In theory, yes, but it's complicated. It might be safer to let the injunction process play out. We'll have official orders, you won't risk getting arrested. But I'd had enough. They'd played dirty for too long, vandalizing my crops and terrorizing me at every turn. Now they were literally digging into my soil. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself the hard way, I muttered. Marcus frowned. At least get the paperwork that proves you're within your rights, and record everything if you do something drastic. Late that night, I sat at my kitchen table, scanning every relevant clause about property owners removing encroachments. My father's old voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that farmland is precious, that once you lose it, you never get it back. By dawn, I felt a grim clarity. I would do whatever it took to protect my inheritance. The morning sky was a wash of pale gray when I decided I couldn't wait on bureaucratic steps any longer. Marcus watched, eyes wide, as I towed a rented bulldozer onto my acreage. I'd secured the machine under the premise of repairing significant storm damage. That explanation wasn't far from the truth. My land had been stormed by people with no respect for boundaries. Neighbors gathered in curiosity, some in pajamas, as the bulldozer rumbled. My mother stood on her porch wringing her hands. A couple of construction workers at the site looked confused, probably wondering what I intended. The fear coiled in my gut was offset by righteous anger. If the developer insisted on crossing the line, I'd physically re-establish it. Marcus leaned in, voice low. Are you sure? This is the nuclear option. Once you start, there's no going back. I nodded, my grip on the controls tightening. They destroyed my crops, trespassed on my land, and threatened everything I've worked for. The courts might take months or years. Meanwhile, they'll finish building. I'll lose any leverage. He exhaled, stepping back to film with his phone, ready to document. Do it carefully. Don't go beyond what's really yours. I advanced the bulldozer slowly, feeling its power vibrate beneath me. Heart hammering, I steered toward the steel rods that had crept onto my property. My boundary stakes stood a few feet behind them. Under normal circumstances, I'd never imagined myself doing something like this. Intentional destruction of someone else's build. But it was on my soil, something they had no right to place there. The first crunch reverberated through my arms, rebar bent and snapped beneath the bulldozer's blade. Construction workers shouted, some stumbling away. A foreman sprinted forward, yelling at me to stop. I kept going, toppling part of the newly erected framing. dust billowed, and the shriek of twisting metal sliced the air. A black SUV screeched up, and sure enough, Mrs. Gray emerged, flanked by 2 board members. She waved her arms wildly, her shouts drowned out by the rumble of machinery. My mind raced. Would the police haul me away for this? Possibly, yet I'd come too far. By encroaching on my farmland, they'd forced my hand. Gradually, I pulled back on the controls, letting the dust settle. Mangled rebar and wooden frames littered the ground. Part of the hotel's foundation was irreversibly damaged. I climbed down, trembling with adrenaline, and clutched the official survey that validated my property lines. Mrs. Gray marched toward me, face taut with fury. "You maniac!" she screamed. "You'll pay for this!" I held up the survey. "Actually, this is my property. You're the ones who crossed the line." She snatched the papers from my hand, glancing at them with trembling fingers. I watched her eyes dart to the official seal. The sight of her utter disbelief would have been satisfying if I weren't so keyed up. Behind us, a crowd formed, phones raised, capturing every moment. Marcus kept filming too. The police arrived minutes later, sirens piercing the tense silence. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the scene of wreckage. I braced for the worst. They approached with measured caution, obviously aware of the potential fiasco. By now, Mrs. Gray was ranting about vandalism, claiming I had no right to damage the developer's property. I calmly pointed out the boundary stakes and the survey. Marcus added that we had video evidence of trespass. One officer, a burly man with a creased brow, asked me to step aside and explain. I did so thoroughly, showing him documents that indicated this portion of the hotel was built illegally on farmland I inherited. The second officer conferred with some city officials who arrived shortly after, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Gray glared daggers at me, phone pressed to her ear. No doubt she was calling the HOA's legal team, possibly the developer as well. But the watchers in the crowd seemed to sense the precarious truth. If the hotel was indeed encroaching on my land, I had the upper hand. Some even murmured words of support. Police took statements from me, from the construction crew, from any witness who'd speak. The city official pored over my survey and frowned. "We need an immediate inspection," he said. "If your data is correct, the developer has built on private property that wasn't for sale." I nodded, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. The official turned to the foreman, telling him all work had to halt, pending a thorough review. The foreman tried to protest, but the city official was firm. With Mrs. Gray screaming in the background, the police taped off the area, turning the once buzzy construction site into a crime scene of sorts. I faced the possibility of legal blowback. Destroying part of a building is no small matter, but in many jurisdictions, a landowner can remove encroachments if they're certain of property lines. My attorney, reached by phone, sounded shocked but not unsupportive. "Let's hope the boundary lines are on your side." They were, and we had the stamped documents to prove it. Mrs. Gray's wrath was palpable. She ranted at the onlookers, decrying me as a menace who endangered public safety. I found it ironic, considering she'd stood by while someone drove a jeep through my fields. One of her associates threatened me with a civil suit. I retorted that I'd countersue for every carat they'd ripped from the soil. For days, the site remained in limbo, city engineers measuring and remeasuring. Meanwhile, the local news jumped on the story. I did a quick interview, explaining that the HOA had harassed me for months, culminating in sabotage of my farmland and unlawful construction on my property. Public sentiment swung in my favor, especially when local farmers rallied, sharing stories of big developers ignoring boundary rules. Social media lit up with commentary on the arrogance of HOAs. Marcus and I braced for retaliation, yet something had shifted. Mrs. Gray no longer swaggered around the neighborhood with absolute authority. The meltdown at the site tarnished her reputation among residents. The developer, furious, tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance about boundary issues. My mother, though scared, was relieved that, for once, the aggression wasn't directed solely at me. The police and city investigators soon concluded that part of the hotel extension indeed trespassed on farmland that was lawfully mine. This led to an official stop work order on that section. Construction beyond the disputed boundary could proceed, but they couldn't legally build on my side. The developers howled about losing money, threatening all sorts of lawsuits, but the city had to uphold property rights. Mrs. Gray doubled down on her hostility. I received new letters accusing me of malicious destruction, though they were overshadowed by the glaring fact that they'd broken ground outside their permitted area. With each new letter, I felt my resolve solidify. If they believed intimidation might shake me, they were mistaken. I'd literally taken a bulldozer to their wrongdoing, and I wasn't about to be cowed. Marcus discovered an additional smoking gun. Internal emails leaked by a disgruntled HOA board member suggesting Mrs. Gray had explicitly pressured the developer to deal with the farmland. One message said, "Grant must be compelled to sell one way or another." Another referenced the Jeep incident as a warning. The insinuation was damning, implying she'd orchestrated the vandalism. This revelation sparked outrage among some Ridgeway Pines residents, especially those who felt manipulated or bullied by the HOA. People started attending board meetings, demanding explanations, or calling for Mrs. Gray's resignation. I wanted justice, but more than that, I wanted my farm safe. Days after the bulldozing, a wave of official documents from the developer's lawyers arrived. They threatened me with damages for property destruction, claiming I'd cost them tens of thousands. My attorney fired back, citing landowner rights regarding encroachments. We also included the potential lawsuit for farmland sabotage, referencing the suspicious Jeep attack and greenhouse tampering. The developer might be wealthy, but they faced a PR disaster that didn't favor them. Tension boiled over at a crucial HOA meeting. I showed up uninvited, ignoring their claim that it was residents only. Many neighbors welcomed me, tired of Mrs. Gray's tyrannical style. When I stood to speak, she tried cutting me off. I held up the survey, the photos, and the leaked emails for all to see. "This is how your HOA handles disagreements," I said, "by trampling a family farm that existed before any of you were here." A murmur swept the room. Some were stunned, others outraged that the HOA would go this far. Mrs. Gray shot me a venomous look, calling me a liar, but I simply gestured at the proof. People demanded an explanation. She fumbled, claiming the emails were out of context, that the farmland was dangerous for neighborhood children. It sounded desperate. The board ended up cutting the meeting short amid shouts and accusations. The fallout was swift. A recall petition circulated among residents. The local press ran stories about an out-of-control HOA attempting to seize farmland. City council members, suddenly under scrutiny, promised to protect legitimate property owners from overreach. With each passing day, it felt like the tide was turning. The Bulldozer Act, extreme as it was, seemed to have awakened the region to the injustice. Mrs. Gray didn't back down quietly. She tried spinning the narrative, claiming I was an anarchist who wrecked valuable property. However, the media discovered her prior run-ins with local businesses, and with her Jeep connection implied in the farmland vandalism, she couldn't regain credibility. Then, to top it off, the developer faced investigations for code violations because city inspectors found corners cut in other phases of the project. Fines started piling up. Meanwhile, I pressed on with farm life. Crops don't wait for legal battles to finish. I replanted destroyed rows, set up new irrigation lines, and used the surge of support from the community to create a local produce subscription. People who admired my stand against the HOA subscribed for weekly deliveries, generating extra income that helped offset my legal costs. One morning, Marcus arrived with news that the city had scheduled a formal hearing. The developer, the HOA, and I would state our cases regarding the partial demolition, property rights, and alleged sabotage. I dreaded the confrontation, but it was the next logical step. If the city ruled that the developer was in the wrong, it would validate my bulldozer action and possibly pave the way for restitution. During the hearing, suits on both sides presented reams of documents. My attorney emphasized the farmland's historic status and the blatant encroachment proven by multiple surveys. The developer's legal team tried to spin it as an honest mistake, claiming their GPS data must have been off. The HOA tried distancing themselves, though the leaked emails contradicted their denials of involvement. I testified about the Jeep tracks, the cut greenhouse lines, the threatening letter. It was exhausting, but near the end, the hearing officer's stance became clear. He repeatedly pointed out that farmland owners hold strong protections, and that the developer's paperwork seemed incomplete or misleading. If the structure was indeed on my land, I had justification for removing it. The sabotage allegations, if proven, would constitute criminal wrongdoing on the HOA's part. Outside the hearing room, Mrs. Gray confronted me with her typical sneer. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You're destroying an entire project, dooming the neighborhood to stagnation." I let out a bitter laugh. "No, I'm defending my family's heritage from bullies who think farmland is worthless. If anyone's to blame for the project's downfall, it's you." She stalked away, stiletto heels echoing on the polished floor. Marcus patted my shoulder. "I think the hammer's about to drop on them." Over the next days, the developer's stock in a related venture took a nosedive courtesy of negative press. They began quietly seeking an exit strategy. The HOA board faced calls for new elections, with petitions demanding immediate changes. Many residents who once blindly accepted the HOA's dictates started criticizing how it had all been handled. The notion of farmland coexisting with the neighborhood gained popularity. A few even suggested my farm should be recognized as a local heritage site. Not long after, the city hearing officer issued a statement. The incomplete section of the hotel that encroached on my property was not authorized and would have to be removed or redesigned. Furthermore, the city attorney's office launched an inquiry into the sabotage claims, thanks to the suspicious pattern of vandalism and Mrs. Gray's incriminating emails. As for me, I was off the hook for the bulldozer incident, so long as no workers had been endangered during my removal of encroachments. Fortunately, the site had been mostly unoccupied at that moment. The developers scrambled to salvage what they could of the hotel, forced to tear down the chunk that intruded onto my farmland. It was almost comical to watch their machinery dismantle the same structure I'd partially destroyed. The tension in my chest receded with each beam that fell. Mrs. Gray vanished from the public eye soon after, rumored to be facing legal repercussions for her role in the Jeep vandalism scheme. Though I felt relief, I also sensed the magnitude of what had happened. I'd risked everything, my freedom, my finances, my standing in the community, to protect these fields. The farmland had become a battleground, but at last I saw hope, that it would remain mine. Marcus teased me that I'd gone from mild-mannered farmer to local folk hero, which made me roll my eyes. But inwardly I was grateful for the support that poured in from neighbors who recognized I wasn't the villain. I wished my father were alive to see how fiercely I clung to his legacy. By the time the developer cleared out, leaving behind an empty lot where the extended foundation once stood, I felt an odd mixture of triumph and sorrow. People had lost jobs, money had been wasted, and the dream of a fancy new hotel ended in debris. But that blame fell on those who tried to cheat and bully their way through. They'd gambled on me bowing out, underestimating how stubborn a farmer can be. With the hotel fiasco halted, the aftermath rippled through Ridgeway Pines. I saw the neighborhood in flux, some residents shaken, others furious at their leadership. The HOA board underwent a messy reorganization, culminating in Mrs. Gray's official removal after her emails tied her to orchestrated intimidation. She faced potential charges if evidence linked her directly to the Jeep incident, though that case remained under investigation. No matter the outcome, her iron grip was broken. Word spread that the developer might sue the HOA for misrepresentation of property lines, claiming they'd relied on inaccurate data. Meanwhile, many homeowners seethed at discovering how their fees had funded legal battles they never approved. The once glossy veneer of Ridgeway Pines was tarnished by scandal. It was poetic justice, albeit painful for some. As for me, I had farmland to rebuild. In the days and weeks following the partial demolition, I turned my attention back to the soil. Some sections were salvageable, others needed replanting. Through grants and donations, I managed to install a better security system, cameras and motion lights to deter further sabotage. My mother found relief in seeing that tangible protection. She still worried, but with the HOA leadership in disarray, the immediate threat seemed muted. Neighbors trickled over with cautious curiosity. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Harriet, an elderly resident, offered me fresh pies and told me she'd lived through enough HOA nonsense to last a lifetime. A younger couple thanked me because they'd always felt uneasy about how the board micromanaged everything from mailbox colors to the length of grass. I took these gestures as signs that not everyone in Ridgeway Pines wanted to chase me off. Marcus stayed at my side, helping me gather statements for potential civil suits. We debated whether to chase down restitution for the vandalism and lost crops. My attorney advised I had a strong case, especially given the evidence connecting the HOA to malicious intent. Part of me yearned for financial compensation to offset the damages. Another part preferred to leave it behind, focusing on the future rather than dragging out fights. Still, accountability mattered. If people like Mrs. Gray got away scot-free, they'd keep popping up in other neighborhoods, bullying smaller landowners. So we proceeded, albeit methodically, lodging formal complaints and letting the police handle the sabotage angle. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but the foundation of our claim was strong. Local news outlets continued to cover the saga, framing it as farmer versus HOA. My bulldozer act became something of a legend. I lost count of how many times folks asked, "How did it feel to do that?" My answer was always the same. I hated resorting to it, but they forced my hand. Funnily enough, it led to an uptick in produce orders, as if some romantic notion of a defiant farmer pushed people to buy more vegetables. Meanwhile, my mother witnessed how the farmland not only survived but thrived. She admitted she hadn't believed we could stand against such powerful forces. Seeing the battered foundation removed, she breathed easier. "Your grandfather would be proud," she told me one evening, resting on a rocking chair by the barn. I wiped sweat from my brow, heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. One day, a group of activists from a local farming collective came to interview me, wanting to highlight how I maintained a family-owned operation despite suburban sprawl. They lauded my commitment, though I felt more like a reluctant poster child. Still, I was glad to shine a light on farmland preservation. If my ordeal helped protect other farmers, so be it. The biggest shift, ironically, came from within Ridgeway Pines. A newly elected board member, a middle-aged woman named Carmen, reached out, expressing a desire to mend fences, literally and figuratively. She proposed a community initiative where residents could volunteer on my farm in exchange for fresh produce discounts, fostering a sense of unity. Skeptical at first, I agreed to consider it. The idea of bridging the gap between suburbanites and old farmland appealed to me, provided it was done respectfully. As tensions cooled, I received official word that city inspectors deemed the developer's expansion plan null and void on my side of the boundary. They couldn't legally build there without my consent. Since I had zero intention of selling, the entire project was scrapped. A few half-finished structures remained near the neighborhood's edge, a testament to corporate overreach. Rumor had it the developer was unloading their local holdings, scurrying to avoid further losses. Though I'd won a significant victory, each day felt like recovery from a bruising fight. My finances needed careful attention. Lawyers weren't cheap, but with renewed local support I found stable footing. As spring approached, new seedlings sprouted, symbolizing my fresh start. The farmland was battered but not broken, like me. Marcus, grinning, sometimes called me the Bulldozer Avenger, which always made me roll my eyes. "Don't you prefer being known for your tomatoes?" he teased. Maybe so, but the name stuck around in some circles. Regardless of the label, I was grateful for the chance to do what I've always done, grow good food and honor my heritage. Over the following months, the dust settled. Lawyers hammered out the final details. The HOA's insurance agreed to cover a portion of my crop losses and fence repairs, albeit grudgingly. That felt like a symbolic gesture of accountability. Meanwhile, the city closed its investigation into the boundary dispute, affirming that I'd lawfully removed an illegal encroachment. Police continued examining the Jeep incident, and rumors circulated that Mrs. Ray could face charges for property damage, conspiracy. For me, life returned to the rhythms of farming. I rose with the sun, tilled the soil, and fed the animals. The farmland, once riddled with tire tracks, flourished under my care. Neighbors who once drove past without a glance now waved. Some visited on weekends, purchasing produce straight from the source. The tension that once stained my interactions with Ridgeway Pines had eased. Marcus joked that I should run for local office, championing farmland preservation, but I preferred the quiet life. Just me, my crops, and the open sky. Still, I found myself stepping into a more public role. Journalists from further afield heard the story of the farmer who bulldozed a hotel foundation and wanted interviews. I spoke bluntly about how crucial farmland is, urging officials to remember that behind every acre is a family's legacy. One crisp morning, as the fields shimmered with dew, I stood at the boundary where the construction site used to loom. Bits of debris had been cleared, leaving bare earth. I recalled my fear that they'd pave this land over, turning it into parking lots or manicured lawns. Instead, it remained farmland. The breeze carried the scent of damp soil, a smell that always felt like home. My mother joined me, smiling softly. "It's so peaceful now," she remarked. I nodded. "Peaceful is good. We've earned it." She looked at me with pride. "Your father would be amazed at how you stood your ground. We never wanted a battle, but sometimes you have no choice." Her words made me exhale slowly, reflecting on the path that led here. It started with a vandalized field, escalated to threatening letters, sabotage, even that bulldozer confrontation. Yet in the end, we held on to what mattered. The price was high: legal fees, sleepless nights, and emotional strain, but the farmland endured. Carmen, the new HOA board member, visited soon after. We walked along the rows, discussing how to foster a better relationship between the residents and my farm. She suggested a harvest festival, possibly letting local kids learn about planting and harvesting. I could see the value in bridging lifestyles, farming and suburban living, so that neither side felt alien. Extending an olive branch might prevent future conflicts. A part of me still bristled at the idea of working with the HOA, given what I'd endured under Mrs. Gray, but Carmen's earnestness softened my cynicism. The old leadership was gone. Maybe building trust now could heal the bitterness. We agreed on a small event for the following season. Nothing too grand, just enough for families to see the beauty of farmland up close. By the time the local press covered this new collaboration, they spun it as from feud to friendship, praising how a once hostile HOA turned over a new leaf. It was an oversimplification. I'd never forget the lengths they went to, but if we could keep farmland safe, letting neighbors appreciate the land instead of coveting it for profit, perhaps the hostility would become a cautionary tale, not a recurring pattern. The settlement checks arrived, covering some of my losses. My attorney teased that I could use it to buy a better tractor. Instead, I paid off debts and upgraded my irrigation system. Every little improvement felt like a victory. I replaced battered fences with sturdier ones, installed a few more cameras, and repainted the barn's exterior, ensuring it shone as a proud emblem of resilience. Marcus and I had a quiet celebration when the final legal hurdles cleared. Over a couple of cold beers by the barn, we reminisced about growing up here, fishing in the creek, building hay forts. Neither of us had imagined we'd face such a corporate juggernaut. We toasted to the farmland's future, promising each other that next time we'd try to stop trouble before it escalated to bulldozers. But we both laughed, acknowledging sometimes bullies only listen to a show of force. Occasionally, I'd still see a lingering scowl from certain individuals around Ridgeway Pines who felt the canceled hotel project robbed them of potential property value. I offered them a polite nod. I knew resentment lingered, but they were in the minority now. Most had grown weary of the conflict. Life in the neighborhood moved on, People painted fences, mowed lawns, and minded their own business. No one tried to dictate my barn color or my farm's existence anymore. Local authorities concluded their investigations into the sabotage. Though no definitive proof surfaced that Mrs. Gray herself drove the Jeep, circumstantial evidence pointed to her or her associates giving the order. She faced a separate civil suit from multiple residents claiming abuse of power. I heard rumors she relocated in hopes of a fresh start. I felt neither pity nor satisfaction, simply relief that she was gone. A day came when I found myself standing by the old wooden sign near the farm's entrance. It read Sorensen Family Farm, letters carved by my grandfather's hand decades ago. This place had survived storms, droughts, pests, and now an all-out war with powerful outsiders. I ran my fingers along the weathered grooves, thinking of the generations who poured their souls into this land. It was humbling to realize I'd nearly lost it. The sense of gratitude that washed over me felt immense. I paused, remembering the swirl of dust as my bulldozer blade crashed into steel. That moment was etched in my memory forever. It was terrifying and exhilarating, a raw expression of defiance in the face of greed. If I could speak to my younger self, I'd say, stand firm from the start. Don't let them edge you out with threats. Show them what it means to hold on to something you love. Harvest season arrived and the fields yielded an abundant crop. It felt symbolic. Resilience rewarded. The roadside stand bustled with customers who heard about my story. Some drove from neighboring towns, eager to meet the farmer who fought the HOA. I greeted them with a handshake, selling fresh tomatoes, sweet corn, and melons. It felt good seeing my farmland recognized for its true value. At the harvest festival arranged by Carmen's new board, kids ran through my pumpkin patch, squealing with delight. Parents took pictures of them feeding goats, patting a docile cow. I set up a small booth demonstrating composting, explaining how scraps return to nourish the land. Even a few board members who once avoided me stopped by to admire the setup. Maybe bridging differences wasn't so impossible after all. That evening, as twilight settled, I surveyed the festival's cleanup. Paper decorations and hay bales were piled off to one side. Families drifted home, content smiles on their faces. Carmen approached, eyes reflecting the glow of hanging lanterns. "Thank you for letting us do this," she said quietly. "It shows how we can coexist." "Better than fighting, right?" I replied, though I felt a twinge recalling the bruises left by previous battles. She nodded. "Much better. If only we'd had a leader more open-minded than Mrs. Gray in the beginning." I shrugged. What's done is done. We look forward now. After she left, I took a moment to stroll through my fields in the dark. The stalks swayed gently in the breeze. My mother's porch light glimmered across the way, a familiar beacon. The ghosts of fear and anger receded into the background, replaced by a quiet pride. I'd proven that farmland mattered, that family heritage was worth defending. In the end, the farmland wasn't bulldozed. Only the illusions of those who believed they could trample me without consequences. My stand had been dramatic, but it served a purpose: to remind everyone that the earth beneath our feet is more than real estate. It's a legacy, a living testament to those who came before, and a beacon for those yet to come. That night I drifted off to sleep with the windows open, the scent of tilled soil in the air. My mind wandered to the future, continuing to improve yields, maybe opening a small farm-to-table store, or forging deeper connections with local families. I pictured the farmland thriving for generations, each new caretaker adding to the tapestry. In that vision, the noise of bulldozers and the hubris of bullies played no part. And so this is how my story ends, or rather, how a new chapter begins. The farmland stands firm, the developer has backed off, and Ridgeway Pines has learned that intimidation can backfire spectacularly. I remain a humble farmer safeguarding my birthright. When I see that repaired fence line, I'm reminded of every ounce of grit it took to keep it secure. If anyone ever tries to cross that boundary again, they'll find me waiting, determined as ever. But hopefully we can all move forward in peace, growing side by side under a shared sky.